Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining our early morning lecture. I think a lot of our members are missing this morning. I guess they are enjoying their last minute of summer vacation somewhere around. Well, but you will never regret to be here with us this morning because we have a very special speaker this morning. The very special speaker is Dr. Lars Thunell, who is sitting by me now. And I said he's very special because he has come here with quite different backgrounds from those we have had so far earlier in this year. As you know, we used to have world-renowned scholars and economists to speak here, but frankly speaking, they have hardly had any real business experiences. They are good academic-oriented economists. But today, Dr. Lars Thunell has a full bunch of experience, extensive amount of experience in managing companies, especially financial companies. Well, he is now the CEO of IFC. IFC, a sister institute of the World Bank. You know what is IFC? You probably know better than I do, but IFC is usually dealing with the private sectors. Unlike, it's a public institute, but dealing with the private firms. That's different from World Bank. World Bank is dealing with mostly governments. So IFC is kind of in between perfectly private, perfectly public, so in between. So it is publicly oriented, but privately operated, like. And before he joined the IFC, he worked several places as CEOs. First, he worked as a CEO for a North European commercial and investment bank named SEB. And before then, he also worked as the CEO of a Swedish insurance company named Trygg Hansa. Is it pronunciation is right?
Absolutely.
Thank you. And before that, he also played a key role, very important role, in resolving kind of banking crisis of the Swedish economy in the early 1990s, I guess. And so he has a really long, extensive amount of field experiences with bank running. I mean, I'm not running bank, not bank run, running banks. Well, so I may be able to describe him in few ways. Well, he is a business-oriented economist, first of all, and he's an expert on capital markets. He also is a top manager. I would say a kind of lifetime manager, a top manager, lifetime CEO. Well, all these three talents put into one person. Well, is that too much for a person to have all these kind of three things together? Well, anyhow, he's going to give us a very useful speech on investment opportunities right after this current global economic crisis. So let's welcome him with a big round of applause.
And thank you for getting up so early, and if you've been on vacation, I hope you had a nice vacation, as you feel good now that you have to get up so early. South Korea is the first stop on an extended trip here in Asia, and it's been a long time since I visited here, and obviously Korea has gone through a tremendous changes since then, and I think this is a great opportunity for me to come here at this particular point in time. I arrived on Tuesday, and I've already learned a lot, and I see very clearly that Korea now is coming out of the recession and the crisis, and is both on the government side and on the corporate and banking side ready to take a new role in the world economy. With, on the government side, the G20 chairmanship, and with on the banking and corporate side, the interest of expanding much beyond Korea. And that's exactly where I think we again can work very closely with Korea and supporting that effort. So I'm very, very pleased to be here. And looking forward, I think Asia will play a critical role in the global economic recovery. We're already seeing that. The region, like every other in the world, has been very much hurt by the world recession. Yet growth, especially in China and India, has been much stronger than in industrial countries. It is, as we've seen the last couple of days in the stock market, signs of it's too early to say, has it really bottomed out, or are we through everything? But most economists now are really forecasting a V-shaped economic recovery for Asia. And I think that would be a very, very good thing for the entire world. I think developing countries in general will play a critical part in getting the global investment back on track. But before I talk further about the opportunities that I see, especially after the crisis, I'd like just to take a few moments and speak about IFC and what shapes our perspective. As you heard, we are part of the World Bank Group. We work very closely with our colleagues, especially at the World Bank, who deals, as you heard, with the governments and public sectors. IFC is the private sector arm in the World Bank Group. In other words, we finance, I work with companies especially. We do some work with governments relating to investment climate issues and more detailed regulation. We are a development institution. Our goal is to promote job creation and improve living standards, especially for the poorest and the most vulnerable people in the world. We provide, and that's our products, financing in terms of both debt and equity, as well as advisory services that helps our clients to become more competitive. We are a decentralized organization with 3,500 people, of more than 50% out in the field, in 104 offices in 82 countries. And we have 90 nationalities working in the organization. And let me take this opportunity to just it's been very helpful coming here that I have my assistant is Korean, Chan, who's sitting over there. Why don't you raise your hand? I'm also very pleased to announce that we just actually promoted Chan to become our manager for China and Mongolia. So that will give him a chance to also be a link much more to the business community and the government up here. During the fiscal year 09, which ended here in June, IFC's new investment commitments, both debt and equity, totaled about $14.5 billion, including about $4 billion that we mobilized from other investors and banks. This was slightly down from the record year, the previous year, which was a record of 16.2 billion. But given that private investments in the world probably were down about 30%, we're very pleased with that. And I think we've fulfilled our counter-cyclical role. And we also had a total of 227 new advisory service projects approved, bringing our total advisory service expenditures during that last year close to 200 million. Let me also say that in contrast to most development organizations, IFC is self-financed. We make profit. And in fiscal year 2008, we made over $2 billion before giving 500 to one of our sister organizations as a grant. And last year, in spite of the turmoils in the market, we actually were break even before, again, giving some money away. And you can then ask, isn't that against your development mission to make a profit? But it's actually the contrary. If you think about it, a successful company that makes money also develops its company, hires people, has a better chance of having high environmental and social standards. So it really comes together, and those two, the development impact and the financial results, are very highly positively correlated, which is very good. We invest together with local and foreign sponsors. We're looking to expand in new markets in developing countries, and of course, as I said, including Korean companies and banks. We are proud to have established long-standing and productive relationships with premier Korean banks such as Hana Bank and Kookmin Bank. And just last month, our board approved an investment together with Kookmin that will support retail banking and SME financing in Kazakhstan. IFC was part of the founding of Hana Bank in the early 1970s, and it became a financial industry leader. Later, we provided support during the Asian financial crisis of the 1990s, which encouraged other investors and coming back into Korea. And Hana Bank emerged from Asia crisis stronger than ever. And now we're working with Hana Bank, and we're very pleased with the cooperation also in places like Indonesia. And we had a nice dinner last night talking about other opportunities. IFC was actually the first new foreign investor to enter the Korean market after that crisis. We invested 25 million in Korea Long-Term Credit Bank in 1998, and this helped it merge with a larger Kookmin Bank. IFC joined Kookmin board and worked with the bank to strengthen its accounting and loan classification practices. This allowed the bank to attract new capital. Kookmin is now, as you know, Korea's largest and strongest bank. In another example, SK Energy and the Korea Export-Import Bank, they are our partners in a Peru LNG project. And we also met with them yesterday, and it's exciting to see how that project is developing. Korea is a great example of a country which has evolved from an IFC finance recipient to a financial partner in other countries. I think Korea's story is a great illustration of what we strive to do with our investments in the financial services industry and in the real sector around the world. We bring financing from commercial investors from around the world into projects with our loan syndication program. This is another way we also help companies in developing countries build relationships with financiers from developed countries. Increasingly, we're attracting financing partners from developing countries looking to invest south to south. We're also finding new innovative ways to invest in other countries. This year, we actually established a subsidiary. I think this is the first time a multilateral organization has established a subsidiary, the IFC Asset Management Company, to allow commercial investors to participate in our equity investments. It will manage our bank capitalization fund, which makes equity investments in systematically important banks in poorer developing countries where the governments can't afford to do the rescue packages. We created this fund with a 2 billion contribution from the Japanese government, JBIC, after the financial crisis to limit the impact of credit crunch in the real economy in smaller and poorer countries which do not have the resources to strengthen the financial sector, as the governments in US, Europe, and many other countries have done. This approach builds on our experience in what worked during the Asian crisis, including here in Korea. The asset management company will also manage a fund for sovereign investments for both pension funds as well as sovereign funds. This will allow them to diversify into frontier countries where we have the expertise and good track record of investing. It's actually interesting. If you look at Africa investments over the last 20 years, measured as last December, and that was after the crisis, we had an annual return on that equity portfolio of over 20%. So Africa has actually have good opportunities. The asset management company or the bank capitalization fund is just one of our crisis response initiatives that we launched this week. We have a microfinance fund aimed at ensuring microfinance lenders that they can get the financing they need to support entrepreneurs in the poor countries. We retooled our advisory service program to help clients cope with restructuring and bad assets and bad assets. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. When we look at South Korea, it is a very competitive economy, and here there is great awareness of the benefits of trade. Unfortunately, global trade will fall more than 10% this year. Early on, we recognized that the financial crisis were forcing many banks to withdraw trade finance lines to preserve liquidity. The lack of trade financing compounded the hit to the export sectors in many developed and developing countries. Exporters, already facing a sharp drop in demand from consumers in developed countries, found that they could no longer serve the customers that they had because trade finance had dried up. IFC had already started a very successful trade guarantee program. In other words, we guaranteed the letters of credit. It connected banks in the developing countries with partner banks in developed countries. In this way, we encouraged new relationships for developing country banks and broadened access to finance, to trade finance. Demand for our trade guarantees surged last fall, so we tripled the size of the program from 1 billion to 3 billion. But we saw that guarantees were not enough. There was also lack of liquidity. So we developed a new trade liquidity program which has been supported with contributions from governments, including Japan. This will be supporting this whole program, about 50 billion of trade over 3 years, which is a significant portion of the G20 announcements where they talked in their communique about $200 billion. We also developed a new infrastructure financing facility aimed at ensuring essential infrastructure projects that they can move forward without interruption in financing. Many of them lost their financing or had not arranged all the financing, and suddenly there was nothing there. Overall, we have raised in our initiatives over $5 billion from public and private sources to support these financial crisis initiatives, which will promote economic recovery. So where are we in the global economy? There are some encouraging signs, as I said earlier. Our economists at the World Bank see a weak economic recovery as the most likely scenario in the next couple of months. In other words, a V, but a rather prolonged V on the one side. And of course, the global economy remains highly dependent on government spending and support from monetary policy authorities. We think that consumers and investors are likely to remain cautious. Yet the financial system itself appears to be strengthening. Some banks in the US are reporting profits and repaying the government support. Business and consumer confidence surveys are improving around the world. The most recent data on industrial production and consumer spending in several countries now show at least a slowing rate of decline. In China, industrial production rose over 3% in May and another 4% in June. I know here in Korea, your open financial systems was one of the hardest and earliest hit places in the world from the current financial crisis. But so far, Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan has recovered about half of their declines in industrial production. For Korea and the rest of Asia, economic development over the short term, of course, depends in large part on recovery of consumer demand among trading partners in the US and Europe, and also, of course, linked very much to China, since I understand 25% of the exports is really related to that. But over the longer time horizon, say 5 years, 10 years, I think Asia's growth path will depend increasingly on the strength of demand from consumers in your own developing countries. I think the best business opportunities will come from meeting the needs of consumers at the bottom of the pyramid. For many more years than anybody thought possible, US consumers propped up the global economic growth through unsustainable borrowing. Now they're saving. I think deleveraging is going to continue for a long time. The US is very likely to return to the level of consumption seen before the crisis. Consumers in developing countries must fill the gap if we are to avoid a long-term slowdown in global output and reach to the potential. And one way to support domestic demand-led growth is the development of local financial market. This is a priority of IFC. The US and other industrial countries are facing the immense cost of caring for aging populations. In contrast, the population in many developing countries, especially in the Middle East and parts of Asia, there the populations are much younger and growing faster, with vast unmet needs for health and education services. At IFC, we're working on some innovative ways to channel investments to these areas. For example, this year we've established a private equity fund for investments in the healthcare sector in Africa. These fast-growing populations also have a vast unmet need for infrastructure. Over 1 billion people lack access for safe drinking water. A lot of food produced in many developing countries is wasted because the producers don't have the proper storage and refrigeration facilities. In Africa, when I was there, I heard that 40% of the food consumed is actually perished on its way to the consumer. Infrastructure needs are compounded by the rapid urbanization as people move to the cities and creation of megacities. The movement of people from the farm to the city has huge implications for food. Agriculture producers must become more productive and mechanized. The cost of adapting to climate change are rising as fast as global warming. We have to find new, cleaner, and cost-effective sources of energy to fuel the global economy. The International Energy Association predicts 97% of the projected increases in greenhouse gas emissions over the next 2 decades will be coming from developing countries. Developed and developing countries alike need clean energy. Solutions to these problems are the big opportunities of tomorrow, and these solutions will have to come from the private sector. The public sector in most countries are now coping with growing budget deficits and resource constraints. The private sector and its ability to innovate and have entrepreneurship will be the engine of growth. I think it is appropriate that Korea takes over the leadership of the G20 this year. This is an opportunity for Korea to show global leadership and share its experience in development. It reflects Korea's increasingly important role in the world. As I mentioned earlier, Korean banks once turned for IFC to financing. Now Korea companies are partners with IFC in providing finance to private sector companies in less developed countries. the G20 growing clout reflects the rising importance of developing countries. Korea's development in the way it learned and recovered from the Asia crisis and the way it responded to the current crisis are examples for the rest of the world. I will conclude by saying that I think Korea will provide good leadership for the G20, which is now dealing with problems like financial system reform and regulation, promoting sustainable growth and reducing poverty, all areas where Korea has experience. Korean policymakers have expertise in trade, infrastructure, financial market reform, and corporate governance. These are also priority areas for the World Bank Group and especially for IFC. I hope that we can deepen our relationship with our Korean partners, both on the public and the private side. It is also symbolic that the G20 presidency is in Asia, the region leading the economic recovery. Over the long run, I'm very optimistic over the economic opportunities for the region and especially for its developing countries. Thank you very, very much for this opportunity to speak, and I'll be very happy to take any questions.
Which he has accumulated while he was working as a banker and capital market expert. So I think it may be useful for you to take advantage of his stock of knowledge. Okay, thank you. If you have any comments and questions, you can raise your hand. And I'd like to require one thing. When you make a comment or question, just limit yourself within 2 minutes at the most. Because to save time and having talk a little more. Okay, Dr. Kim?
Thank you, Dr. Thunell, for your presentation. I appreciate it. I have 2 questions. One relating to today's subject, the other one a little away from it, but your national experience with Swedish bailout of the banks in the past. The first question deals with, you mentioned very cautiously that the U.S. consumption level is not likely to come back soon. I think you're extremely gentle in describing that. I would say, take the time of this global crisis, before and after, it's going to be 2 different worlds. There's no way the world is going to see superpower like US being able to finance the global consumption by 6% national GDP deficit. That translates to roughly about 1.5% of the global GDP. Now, as you know, any country which went over 3% of the deficit soon had to run to IMF for help because the national financial impairs. U.S. had unique power to do this only because it's the owner of the dollar, which was the world currency. Now, this is not going to be ever repeated by anybody, including the United States. U.S. is not going to spend that kind of money. So therefore, I would say, first of all, regardless of what we do in fixing up the economy, that level difference of the global consumption is not going to come back. Now, if you take that, then the global productive capacity is in surplus in total. From the IFC's investment opportunities, how do you reconcile this with the future growth? That's the first question. Second question is, when Sweden bailed out the banks, and the US was talking about a lot of the Swedish model, how to bail out the banks, and you managed to do this with equity position in the banks, and therefore what I understand is that net result was actually the profit to the government rather than loss. I would like to know a little bit more about details of that inside. Thank you.
Well, I agree with you on the. I think we're going to see a very different world after the crisis. In many respects, I think the risk level or the risk appetite is going to be different. Compensation systems will hopefully be different. The U.S. consumer who was net or not saving at all, but actually spending, has now moved to a saving something. The savings rate I think is up to 7% in the United States now, which is back to where it's been. And so I agree with you that will have many implications, and I think the debate we have about the US dollar is one of them, and it's interesting to see what's happening here in Asia on that front, and the discussion around the Chinese currency, and we're having dialogue, for example, or could we support trade in renminbi in the future as part of our trade finance program is one of the discussions. So I think from our point of view and the implications, as I said, the opportunity, and there has to be more consumption, local consumption. The economies in Asia will have to be driven not so much by exports but by domestic consumption. And I think it's very interesting if you look at the Chinese stimulus package, for example, which encouraged the buying of refrigerators, which I understand has benefited some Korean companies, for example. And I think those are the type of things we're going to see, and that's why I said I think being able to adapt products for that group, and not only the middle class, but if you can figure out ways, and as a developing institution, to actually package things for the very poor, I think there's a big untapped market there. And there are some very good examples. There's a Korean or an Indonesian company that's actually have been able to compete with Procter & Gamble in Indonesia when it comes to shampoo, because they did the packaging very different. They did small packages, one-time packages, so the poor people could afford to buy them. I think those type of innovative things in terms of distribution and packaging is going to be very, very important. I think what we're seeing now, the business opportunities in mobile phones and bringing those out is probably the most important thing we can do as a development institution, because we know that if you got a good mobile phone system, that increases the economic growth potential of any company. It's one of them. Some research indicates that's probably one of the most important things we can do is connect people with each other. So these are the type of things we're trying to focus on, and that I'm trying to encourage businessmen in the developed world to this is the you looked at this is high risk countries, but look at our returns that we've had in Africa, and that's better in many other countries, and so I think people will have to start questioning their own risk assumptions and looking against opportunities, and I think those are going to be in the developing countries. Now, the Swedish crisis, very similar to many other financial crises. It was a deregulation. It was an explosion in borrowings, financing, real estate. Swedish business people who thought they were brilliant and had figured out a new way to manage risk, and therefore could have much higher leverage than anybody else and outbid everybody else for real estate around the world. And of course it didn't work. There was a crisis, and the Swedish krona was pegged to the euro, and we ended up with very high interest rates. The overnight rate was over 500%. And then it all crashed, and there was a major devaluation. And there was a number of banks that or the whole banking system ran into real problems, and especially one bank that I had decided to join, and then the crisis hit before even I joined. And I joined as deputy CEO. And the government basically established the bank was taken over by the government, and we then split the bank into a good bank and a bad bank, both owned by the government. And the assets, the bad assets, the bad credits were transferred over to Securum, as it was called, the bad bank, or the asset management company, which I then headed. And we started out, a couple of people, and at the top, I think we're about 1,000 people working on the workouts. If you looked at the consolidated accounts for that asset management company, a year later, we're actually 30,000 people, because we had a lot of industrial companies that were consolidated. And we developed a scheme where basically we said, in practice, we're owners of these assets. So let's not only have bankers in here, bring in people like private equity people, real estate people, hotel people, people who knew, industrial people who knew how to manage these things. And we packaged them so that we could sell. Most of the assets were real estate, so we could sell a single building, or we could sell a bunch of real estate, residential real estate in Stockholm, or commercial real estate in Gothenburg. And we established not only the assets, but a management structure around it. So we sold, as I said, some of them to other companies, but we could actually then also introduce a number of companies on the stock exchange. So that today, the largest real estate company in Sweden actually came out of this crisis. We also introduced IPO'd a specialized hotel company, hotel owning of real estate assets, and they are now. Saw them recently. They are now over in the United States looking for properties to buy as part of the U.S. crisis. So things come around. And we had a major industrial company called Nobel Industries, which we merged into Akzo Nobel, or Akzo of Holland, and became what is today Akzo Nobel, major multinational company focused very much on paint. So this was the way we tried to work. And we had a very long, we were given by the Swedish Parliament 15 years to sort it out. And we always had to tell everybody we were looking at this as a long-term project, but of course, in our daily lives, we looked at it as as we should do it as quickly as possible, but maximizing the money. So I could leave after about 3 years, 3-4 years, and then everything was basically set up. So it was a matter of just execution, and the company could be closed down after 7 years, and the Swedish taxpayer actually got its money back. And what was the key successes to this, and why we were able to do it? I think there's a couple of things. One was that the government was very wise in that they said, first of all, they kind of created a coalition government around this particular issue. They agreed we're not going to do politics around this issue. We're going to try to do, this is like war in a sense, we're going to try to do what's good for the country and not make short-term political gains out of it. They established a special unit as part of the finance ministry called the Bank Emergency Board or Authority, which actually had some independence, and that way you distance it away from the political short-term issues again. And on the secure side, they put in place, even though it was a government-owned entity, a board which had the majority of board members, most of the board members were actually from the private sector. And it was only a couple of political representatives there. And when it came to, as always in these issues, bonuses and compensation was, for example, a big issue. And they established they didn't go in and look at the details of the individuals, but they established some guidelines that everybody should follow. So I think that these were a couple of the reasons why it worked out well and why it has become kind of one model for how to do it. I very often get the question, how much of this is applicable in other financial crises, for example, the United States. And I think obviously the U.S. is much bigger. It started out with the subprime crisis. So it is, in that sense, very, very different. But I think there are some key learning experiences that we had in Sweden which were important. One was the governance issue of course, and the keeping politics out of the business decisions as much as possible. The other one was the importance of bringing in people who not only bankers, but actually who knew the underlying assets. I think those were a couple of the key, and having run a kind of a principles-based framework from the government side. But the difference with the U.S., of course, is that you had the subprime and you had the securitization. And one of the big problems with the securitization is that you don't know who is actually owning the asset, and it's so split up. So you don't get people to the table. It's actually with the what's called the credit default swap markets also being involved in this very much, being part of this. You actually have people at the table who have sold the risk, but they're representing the end investor, and their interest, they know that they will get paid if there's a default. So some of the people who are actually working on the workouts have an interest in getting a default, because that means that they will get paid, even if the whole system will not be benefit of it. So I think that you saw that same problem in the crisis of Lloyd's of London in the reinsurance business back in the 80s. It was the same thing. There are very big problems with the reinsurers. So I think that's been one of the issues that makes some of the experience and slightly different. And of course, the size of the U.S. market is very different. But I think there was, as I said, some learning experiences that I've also had discussions with the U.S. administration about, some other governments.
Do you have any exit policy of the government from that investment?
But as I said, when this Secure was established, and also there was some other rescue things for other banks, the bills defined a certain amount of money that they put to disposal and a time period to do this. And then the government said that it would allow to take this. And as I said, we at Securum, we said, no, we have to talk about this, because every time somebody, a minister, came out and said this has to go fast, the next morning I had these vulture funds on the phone saying you should sell to me quickly, because that's what the politicians are saying. So we had to talk about that we should have a long time, but we actually had to execute as quickly as possible. And as I said, we tried to do that with the selling whichever best way, and trying to make the assets we had as liquid as possible, by doing the IPOs and then being able to sell or merge into the example with Nobel going into AXO, which gave us shares in AXO Nobel, or the government got shares in AXO Nobel. It was one of the largest shareholders in AXO Nobel, and then after a couple of years, they could exit that one. So it was done in a way of trying to make it as liquid as possible and get it away again from the politicians as much as possible. That was the strategy, and it worked very well.
Thank you for your time and speech. You mentioned that you are co-investing with the sovereign funds, or you are planning to co-invest or co-work with the sovereign funds such as KIC and national pension funds, not just in Korea and other countries. Now, in terms of investment strategy, I'd like to hear your opinion about the differences between the sovereign funds and IFC when you make the decisions.
I think sovereign funds in general have, you have to look at them, and pension funds also, you have to look at them individual, because every country has a little bit of different characteristics. But if I were to pick up, one common theme is that they have very much a fiduciary responsibility to their citizens and their retirees, if it's that, or taxpayers in the sense of the sovereign funds, which means that most of them have instructions to try to maximize the profits over the long run with a reasonable risk. And then, of course, they have the normal governance where they define what risk levels they're willing to take and what time horizon they should have. And that gives them the mix between debt and equity and alternative investments. That's how most of them are set up. And when we look at things, as I said, we are a developing institution, but the good news is that our development impact, and we measure that, is very, very positively correlated with our financial results. So when we look at it in practice, we've seen that we actually can meet the returns of any private equity firm that is run with the same type of risk levels as we are. And as you heard, my example with Africa, that's very clear. So what we were thinking and looking at it was, with all this money in these funds and with the business opportunities as we see them, and as I talked about, being in the developing world, and that is being seen by many of these sovereign funds as well. And they've seen the risks, that it's not risk-free to invest in the United States or Europe or anywhere else, meant that they have started to look at how can we come in a bigger way in the developing world. And that's when we said that here is an opportunity to match these two things. They want to increase their allocation, the asset allocation to the developing world. The stock markets themselves are relatively limited in these countries, especially the poorer countries. We have a network of 104 countries, a great track record, and if we can then get them in pro rata in our projects, so they will take, say, 25% of our equity investments, that's a perfect match. And that's what I think some of these funds are seeing, and that's why we now have, and we hope to be able to have a first closing here in the fall of this sovereign fund with a number of investors, and some of them are just looking at it from a purely, as we talk with them, purely financial perspective, looking at the returns and the ability to getting access to this network to learn. Secondments, they all want to second people to us because they want to learn as part of this process. But they also see, some of the governments that I talked to also see the political benefits of actually having a win-win, not only a good financial return, but they could also support developing growth in those countries and support IFC at a very at actually no cost, which is a clear win-win. So that's how it works.
Thank you, Dr. I presume IFC is active and successful in financing and investment in developing countries of Africa. And you said you had experience about 10% rate of return in African countries. So I wonder how much these developing countries are affected by current global financial crisis, and also I still see the investment vision in African countries.
As I said in some other speeches, that the financial crisis that was now started on the Wall Street was like a tsunami going across the world, and I don't think there's a single individual, unless you're maybe in the middle of Amazon or something like that, that was not affected. Everybody was basically affected by it, and so all the countries in Africa was affected. Foreign direct investments went down, exports down, commodity prices down, remittances, which are very important for many of these countries. If you take Central Asia, I think Tajikistan, something like 35% of their budget is remittances, and those are going down across the board. Credit, even I visited Madagascar, and they're very kind of isolated and not very much integrated in the world economy. But they had some of their banks was owned by foreign banks, European banks, French banks especially, and as these French banks had to look at their capital position, they withdraw money out of their banks in Madagascar. So even if there was nothing wrong with the at that point, the borrowers or the banking system in Madagascar, the effect that France had a problem, created a problem in Madagascar. Mm-hmm. So these linkages are tremendous, and that's why I think we felt that we should create these initiatives and try to mobilize additional funds. The World Bank has done a lot of that as well, and I think it is very, very important. Going forward, I think commodity prices have come down. There is tremendous, I think, needs, and if you do it well, you can create very good companies. There is need for infrastructure. There is need for, as I said, the fact that 40% of the food that is produced in Africa has perished on the way to the consumer, to me is a huge business opportunity. Because savings, and it's like energy efficiency. The paybacks are just 18 months or 3 years or something like that, and extremely quick. So I think there are lots of opportunities. The problems, of course, is I would highlight two. One is the lack of government institutions and capacity to make decisions, corruption as part of that, and that one has to deal with. And the second one is infrastructure. Because if you're going to have power outages, or if you can't transport the goods that you have produced, there are actually some studies showing that in a plants in Africa you can reach the same productivity numbers as you can in Asia. But the problem is that when you go out the door of the plant, how to get it to the export market is almost impossible. So I think those are the two challenges that one would have to look carefully at, and there are risk mitigants, and we have a lot of experience in some of these things, and that's one of the reasons why companies like to work with us when they dip their toe into a new country.
Good.
Thank you, Dr. Thunell, for your prominent presentation this morning. Yes, I would like to express our gratitude to the IFC and the World Bank. When I started my career all the 1960s at the Korea Development Bank, during the time IFC and the World Bank, that they had supported and encouraged the Korean economy development during that time. After that, as you know well, this time Korea has accomplished the 10th level, largest economy in the world, and a complete democracy. We thank you. We as appreciate guarantee that during the time the international financial institutions to support the Korean development at this moment. And the next time, I have a question or advice to you. When you evaluate to lending some developing countries, how to evaluate? What is the priorities? Long-term experience, I will give you advice. The great country leadership is the best, most important things. We have great leadership during the time. Please remember. Thank you.
Evaluate some priorities.
Priorities. First of all, thank you very much for those nice comments, and I've been very warmed by the tremendous hospitality and warmth that I have received, and I think that's not because of me, it's because of IFC when I do my trip here. So thank you very much to everybody. And when it comes to evaluation of projects, what we try to look at is the development impact. And as you say, if we're going to have an impact, you will have a much bigger chance to have that impact if you got a good leadership and a good context. And that's why we look at indicators like that, including the one we produce called the Doing Business Report, that looks at the ability, basically the investment climate. But it goes beyond that, as I said, with corruption and other things. And so that's the first thing we look at. We look at the financial opportunity, because, as I said, that's very much tied to the development impact. We look at who is the sponsor, who are we working with. More and more we work with local companies and local entrepreneurs. But one of the problems, again, is that in some countries, the government's relatives tends to be very much involved in, the politicians' relatives tends to be very much involved in many of the businesses as part of the system, and then we don't do business with what we call politically exposed people. We just stay away from that. And finally, we look at what we call our additionality. What do we add to it? Is it the financials? Is it our advisory services? Is it political protection? Or what is it? And I think that's a very important question, because if the private sector can do this by themselves, they should do it. And we should move on to the next thing. So just like we left Korea, I mean, there's some, and if you look at China today, we don't do much business in the east and on the coast of China. We do things, and then here we develop this strategy together with the Chinese government. You know, it's part of their harmonious policy. We try to work in the rural areas. We try to work on climate change issues and energy efficiency. We try to work with Chinese companies going abroad. That's how we kind of changed our business mix, and that's how we try to do it. And if we got a very, very corrupt and bad country, I think the thing that I always encourage is that at least we should do work on microfinance, because that's at the bottom of the. It's normally not at all politically affected, and you will create small entrepreneurs who can grow. We should remember that all big companies have been small at one point, and those can then create a basis for both economic growth, but also empower some people so that you get perhaps closer to a democracy and changes in the government structures. So that's how we try to look at our projects.
Thank you so much for your presentation, as well as taking all kinds of questions. And I think it has been very useful, and we hope you have a good trip to other countries and share your views. And when you come back to Korea, let me know. And he has to leave this afternoon, I think. I told.
Yeah, I'm leaving tonight. Yes.
So,
Mongolia.
Well, given a tight schedule, we really appreciate your presence here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Welcome. Really
Congratulations.
Good.
Thank you very much.